Hey, good morning, guys. Hope everybody's doing well. Today, we're going to take a look at the first portion of our Chapter 16, Rise to Totalitarianism. Today's thing is really going to focus more on the post-World War I era, where basically we're watching how society kind of moves away from the gentleman's war more into this post-optimistic, post-enlightenment type feeling that's centered around all of the new technologies that have come around throughout not only the Industrial Revolution, but also in World War I, and then move beyond just the Victorian age and a lot of the moralistic values that came with it. As we get into the Roaring Twenties, what the Roaring Twenties were really all about was not only the American endeavor and kind of the American dream, but more importantly, across the world, people were more individualistic rather than being wrapped up in those nationalistic views that had dominated the late 1800s and the early 1900s. So as we get into the Roaring Twenties, what the Roaring Twenties was all about was not only the rapid cultural change, but also bringing about kind of a very clear perspective as to what your culture's identity was. Now, the Roaring Twenties, while it was about kind of individualism, it also did bring about a lot of cultural perspectives that are going to be new to, especially in the United States, but also across the world. All right. One of the big ones that we'll talk about here in a few minutes is the Harlem Renaissance, as the African American culture really starts to blossom out of not only New York City, but also a lot of the other urban centers that were widely dominated by the growth in the urban worker, as well as the African American migration to a lot of these big industrial cities where the jobs were available. We also see the rise culturally of the jazz phase, as well as art and literature. So the 1920s were more about just kind of self-expression as well as economic explosion. All right, and with that economic explosion, obviously, we're going to see a massive growth in personal wealth as well as the wealth of our entire nation. The United States really comes out of World War I as the most prominent economic nation in the world, and from that, we've really kind of established ourselves as the preeminent power, not only financially, but also militaristically. So a little bit more on kind of the jazz age. We saw some of the most celebrated jazz musicians becoming very notable during the 1920s. People like Duke Ellington, also individuals like Louis Armstrong, both of which should be semi-familiar. Many of you are familiar with Duke Ellington because of kind of his big band type of almost like ragtime blues type of big band, as well as Louis Armstrong, as he not only popularized jazz across the country, all right, but also popularized the style that is very notorious throughout most of the 20th century, not only in the blues area, but also in jazz, R&B, as well as rap. And that styling is now kind of known as scat music, where you're taking random syllables and kind of making sounds from that. All right, and we also are going to start to see the rhythm and the kind of the up-tempo phase of music really starts to help individuals express themselves culturally as well as nationalistically. And we'll see kind of the rise of the female version of an independent woman throughout the 1920s as kind of these rogue, renegade ladies that were standing on their own 2 feet and that were known as the flappers. Now, the flapper, while it does come with kind of a little bit of a negative connotation, it really shouldn't, because these ladies were very independent women, and they were not necessarily shunned, but they were looked at as a little bit different than some of their typical traditional female counterparts. Not only did they defy the convention and break the norms and the gender roles that were typically established with them, but they also become really a symbol of how individuals are kind of reinventing themselves, not only with their own individual identity, but also kind of reestablishing themselves on the economic, the political, and the social landscapes. Now, while these ladies were relatively few in numbers, they had a massive, massive influence on not only the 1920s, but also movements like the temperance movement, movements like prohibition and the 18th Amendment. And then moving on, they also kind of have that ripple effect on the women's suffrage movement all right, throughout the middle 1900s within the United States, as women start to develop more of a larger role in government, as well as first off getting the ability to vote. You start to see that tidal wave of momentum really starting to go into their favor. Now, while these flappers kind of set the stage and they're the kind of the I would say mold breakers for the modern woman, their experimental, bold styles and manners didn't necessarily sit well with their male counterparts. A lot of males viewed this as very confrontational, as well as a major threat to kind of the hierarchy of society. Now, as we know, right, women in the 20th century really should probably thank these flappers for really kind of getting that mode of thinking subtly starting to change. All right, and as we started to see the women's role throughout World War I in the workplace begin to change, that only continues to expand as we get into the roaring 20s of technology and industry and all of the positive economic growth that we start to develop. And then, as we know, all right, women are going to be able to vote in all of these elections after they're given the ability to vote. But it also will take some time for a lot of this to really start to sink in culturally. Now, one of the big reactions during the Jazz Age in the Roaring 20s was the prohibition of all alcoholic beverages during the 1920s. Now, this was designed for a couple different reasons. On a surface level, the main goal was simply to eliminate the drunkenness and the resulting abuse that was starting to become way more widespread than in previous generations. With this economic wealth and with a lot of this ingenuity and independence and kind of individualism, we started to see people breaking away from what the traditional values were, having typical traditional morals, and we started to see individuals kind of developing a lot more of these very vivid vices. Drunkenness, vices like, not only drugs, alcohol, but also, maybe even some of the more immoral, what at that point in time they viewed as unbiblical type behaviors, right? And from the ability to try and get rid of the saloons and the bars and the prostitution and the gambling, it also was designed to really kind of take a big bite out of organized crime. And this was what really the Prohibition Act was really all about. It was kind of taking away the major teeth that organized crime had. But as we know, organized crime is often going to be able to adapt its surroundings. So what was originally intended to basically maim organized crime, it actually made it so much stronger. And then it thrives throughout the 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s, as we start to see the rise of the major crime families, not only in the United States, but across the world. All right, whether it's, the mobs in the United States, whether it's the Yakuza in Japan, whether it's in each of these industrial nations, there was some form of organized crime. And that organized crime syndicate continues to grow and grow and grow as more, we'll say, black market type of opportunities really start to show up. So one of the big ways that organized crime is able to get around prohibition is through the supplying of illegal alcohol. They see this as an opportunity where there was a major demand. There's also the ability to make a large sum of money from that process. So they would hire, basically just like any other business would, from the top down, looking for individuals that would be willing to fulfill some portion of kind of that marketplace. All right, from start to finish, throughout the entire business process, you needed people along the way that were not only masters of their craft, whether it was, the distilling of the liquor, whether it was the transportation, whether it was the distribution, whether it was, greasing the right hands of law enforcement or government officials. Each of these individuals kind of plays a role. Right, and we start to see the rise of the bootlegger, the rise of kind of the backwoods distiller connect with these urban crime syndicates to form these illegal bars and these illegal distribution networks that will pretty much span the entire globe during this period. Now, even though the Prohibition Act only truly legally impacted the United States, it's going to vastly influence kind of through a ripple effect across the world. obviously where there is a demand, right, you're going to find a way. And many of these bootleggers were coming from foreign nations as well as individuals that were willing to distribute this stuff illegally inside the United States. All right, so with the supplying of this illegal liquor, it becomes a very complex operation, and it takes a very, very skilled mind to really kind of iron out all of the small details and to run it very, very fluidly and efficiently. So, any ideas that organized crime or a bunch of bullies and a bunch of meatheads is the furthest thing from the truth. Many of the individuals at this point in time in organized crime were extremely brilliant, extremely intelligent, extremely well-versed and well-educated, to a point where they were taking their skills that they had acquired over the early portions of their life and basically applying it to an opportunity. It just so happened that that opportunity was illegal at this point in time. So some of the challenges to traditional beliefs that are moving us away from the Victorian era values were the things that were kind of becoming a lot more mainstream. Science was really challenging a lot of the religions of the war. All right, we weren't misguided anymore, or didn't really have the rose-colored glasses type of approach when it came to war. It wasn't a grand adventure anymore. We had experienced it. We had seen it not only be mainstream, but also it was really putting people's ideas into focus and kind of bringing out some of the contradictions and the historical inaccuracies that generation after generation after generation had passed down, either through biblical text, all right, or through kind of the spoken histories. All of this was becoming one big kind of tangled mess, and it was difficult for the individuals of the 1920s and 30s and 40s to really decide for themselves what their true core values were versus what the expectations of their previous generations were. It had nothing to do really with the loss of belief in a higher power, but it had everything to do with more of an educated approach. Individuals wanted the answer to the question why, and weren't just willing to suffice for that's just the way it is. And fundamentalism is going to be something that really is combating against a lot of this post-Enlightenment, post-World War I thinking. Because individualism is really on the major rise, a lot of your more traditional families, traditional cultures were really starting to put up a major fight towards how they were going to combat the opposing side. And the fundamentalists are the ones that are leading that charge. They're looking at kind of not only pushing the ideas of religion, but very, very staunch conservative religions with very little wiggle room. It was truly black and white to the fundamentalist, whereas we're living in the gray area with a lot of these more postmodern type individuals. Now, one of the big kind of petri dishes for how this is all going to work out comes in the form of what is known as the Scopes trial. Now, in the state of Tennessee, there was the general belief, obviously coming from the Bible Belt, that certain things should be taught in schools and certain things should not be taught in schools. One of the big things that was prevented in the state of Tennessee, as well as many other states, was the teaching of evolution in science classes in public education. Now, a biology teacher actually in the state of Tennessee, kind of was fighting that constitutional law. And that was the idea that he wanted to be able to present the information of evolution side by side with the idea of creationism that had long been taught in public schools. So it wasn't necessarily one is better than the other, but he wanted to present this information to his students so that they could have the ability and the freedom of choice to see which avenue they believed in, or was it a combination of the two? All right. He wasn't asking his students to kind of set aside their religious beliefs, but he was giving them the whole picture, or at least in his mind, what the whole picture might be. Now, constitutionally, Mr. Scopes here, he was, obviously breaking the law. He was convicted by through trial, and as actually he was judged by a court of his peers. But this is still typically viewed as a victory for evolutionists, because even though individuals like scopes, right, were kind of being convicted because of the constitutionality of it. It was bringing about the discussion that individuals should have the freedom of information. So even though he is convicted, it's a victory because the members, not only of these specific conservative states, but also across the world, were really starting to bring into question the methods in which our cultures were built upon. Rather than giving and saying that we're having the idea of freedom of choice and freedom of religion and freedom of speech, now we're actually seeing people that are putting that to the test and trying to practice it in a new, more modern sense. And because of this, we're really starting to see individuals, because of the individualism and because of kind of the change in perspective, we're starting to kind of seek their own endeavors. And America was one of those nations that really sees a lot of the individuals that are disillusioned and the individuals that were rejecting the way conservative values were telling them to do things, and we're actually seeking asylum in other nations. Right? And this lost generation kind of basically diasporas around the world or spreads out around the world, where we start to see these pockets of kind of expatriates of the United States that are living in foreign nations. France is a large destination. South America is a large destination for a lot of these disillusioned Americans that are looking to kind of move themselves away from the Western values, be a little bit more holistic in their way of life, a little bit more simplistic. All right, and the expatriates are going to become a major wave of influence throughout the years to come, especially as we get closer and closer to not only the rise of totalitarian leaders, all right, but eventually the events that are surrounding World War II. Now, literature does play a role here. We're looking more about the kind of postmodern stream of consciousness ideas. Now, while this is important, obviously in a literature sense, in a historical sense, we're really kind of more focusing on how that literature impacted individuals' belief systems. Now, while it was bringing into perspective thoughts and feelings, we started to see a little bit of a disconnect in how those thoughts and feelings were being put onto pen and paper and the logic and the order that would come with it. So while it's influential, we start to see the rise of literature changes, and obviously the authors are going to be influenced by one another. We won't really see the impact of this until post-World War II, but it begins here in the late 1920s. As we talked about, the Harlem Renaissance is going to be a huge kind of crucible of where the American society has gotten to at this point. The Harlem Renaissance centers around that very pride-delivered, very we'll say, large desire for the African American population to really express and explore not only their unique culture, but how their culture can be a major positive for assimilation within the United States and beyond. And even though this movement starts in New York City in that neighborhood known as Harlem, we also are going to see that these influences spread to the major urban cities around the country. Detroit, San Francisco, Mobile, Alabama, or Atlanta. We'll see Chicago, and a number of these kind of manifest destiny urban cities that start to pop up are all going to be major hubs for not only industrial work, but where there's opportunity. And we see all walks of life are going to meet those places of opportunity, whether it's the African Americans, whether it's the Asian Americans, whether it's the Latin Americans. All of those individuals are all going to descend upon where there is land of opportunity. All right, we also see some major scientific breakthroughs, whether it's Marie Curie, in her division of atoms, or whether it's the idea of Einstein and the theory of relativity, right, or whether it's Fermi's discovery of the atom being split. This is going to be the original kind of, we'll say, foundation that will eventually advance into how we harness it for the atomic bomb and then for energy resources down the line. All right, we'll see major medical breakthroughs. One big one is going to be the discovery of penicillin by Fleming, as well as how we kind of develop a much deeper understanding of the periodic table, and then kind of circling back to Marie Curie. Marie Curie was really looking at not only the ability of atoms and kind of the basic building blocks, but also is going to start to understand a little bit about the reactivity as well as radiation. And Marie Curie, as well as her husband, are kind of at the forefront of how we start to see the ideas of the atoms becoming a whole lot more impactful on science of today. All right, we had psychology that was making a huge breakthrough, whether it was kind of the studies of Sigmund Freud. Now, while we typically kind of group Sigmund Freud as a psychologist, he really was more of a neurologist. He was looking more at the brain rather than the behaviors. But some of his views on the subconscious mind, as well as kind of the deep recesses of instinct, as well as desires, kind of set the stage for what a lot of our postmodern psychological beliefs are. Whether it's getting into, individuals like Piaget in education, or, Watson with behavioralism. All of these different individuals all kind of spur out of what Freud and the unconscious mind were really starting to push. And we did see kind of a little bit of a change in artistic styles. We see kind of the growth of abstract art, as well as kind of a movement away from some of the traditional styles that were looking to kind of reproduce the real world, but now we were starting to see things through a different lens. And obviously where Freud kind of has an impact on the biological and the medical field, we're also seeing that psychological approach will start to impact the arts, literature, music, and such. Now, one of the big final things that we're going to start to see is politically, we're going to start to see some unrest really developing. In the post-World War I era, we really saw two big pushes that were beginning to happen. We were seeing less conservatism. We were seeing more workers' rights becoming a lot more, we'll say, larger in scale, as well as we started to feel the rumblings of things like socialism and communism, as well as a little bit of the independence movements, the self-rule movements. Now, where we talked about India, we're going to see similar things start to happen, but they're going to happen in nations that are fairly industrialized. For instance, we're going to talk about the major Irish question, which dealt with home rule in the nation of Ireland and the separation, how the British were looking to kind of partition the Shamrock Isles into two separate nations. Northern Ireland, that would be controlled by the British Parliament, and then the southern portion of the island that would be under the Irish Parliament. But as we see, all of these things are going to eventually kind of come to a head with not only the major economic boom that was beginning to happen, right, but the looming depression economically that we know is about to happen. So in terms of the Irish independence movement, it really kind of centered on Great Britain trying to almost keep a container around the Irish population. Now, the British population had used the Irish population for a long period of time as kind of an in-between, almost like slave labor force, yet it wasn't really slavery. The Irish had always been viewed as inferior to the British. The British believed that they were smarter, they were more wealthy, they had more influence, and the Irish were just simply kind of a poor man's version of a European. They were used for their agricultural, their sheer size and sheer manpower, but outside of that, they really weren't given a whole lot of credit. And although we start to see the Irish really kind of making a serious case to rule themselves, the British really don't give them much of an opportunity. And then following World War I, we start to see that the Easter Rising and the Irish independence movement were starting to gain a little bit of traction through their civil disobedience, but it wasn't quite reaching the right tone. And by the end of World War I, the English Parliament was completely disregarding the Irish, and it had come a point where we now needed to see a little bit more radicalism taking place. And when England continued to refuse to grant home rule, we started to see a militant group of Irish individuals known as the Irish Republican Army, or the IRA, begin a not only full-scale guerrilla conflict against the British oppressors, but also, more importantly, we're going to see this turn into a multi-decade, extremely bloody and extremely tense conflict that's going to still leave a lot of raw feelings, even in the British Isles and the Shamrock Isles, even of today. And what we do eventually see is that because the IRA tries to combat the British militaristically, we'll see in 1922 Ireland will be officially partitioned and divided, and we start to see that Northern Ireland will still remain under the British rule. It'll be under Protestant rule, and then we'll see the more Catholic Irish Parliament ruling the majority of the Irish Free State, which is pretty much the southern 2/3 of the Shamrock Isle. And we'll see the IRA will continue to fight all the way through the 1970s until we start to kind of see kind of almost like an armistice beginning to develop. And we'll talk more about that after the Cold War. Our final thing we're going to talk about is the Red Scare. And as we talked about during World War I, the disease from the East was a major threat to spread. And the Red Scare centered on this idea of the fear that not only communism would infiltrate a lot of these democracies, but more importantly, that it had its target and its sights set on the United States. Now, at the heart of the Red Scare was the Attorney General Mitchell Palmer, who was convinced that these radicals were conspiring not only to overthrow the government, but trying to install some form of communism. And this centered around a June 1919 series of bombings that happened kind of right at the, we'll say, pinnacle of tensions in the post-World War I era. And as we know, and as we can kind of relate to now, sometimes paranoia leads to some rash decisions. And what A. Mitchell Palmer really kind of set in motion was a series of almost like witch hunt-like attacks from his special task force that was conducting raids to arrest these suspected subversives, or what he anticipated were communists. And the Palmer raids were just the first of many kind of stages of the Red Scare, where we're looking to root out not only the communists, but also to kind of galvanize the people of America to show that they are threatened by these outside endeavors. And this is something that will play a big role when we get into the Japanese internment camps and we get into kind of the isolationist period in the lead up to World War II, where we were very, very leery of these outside influences, and we were missing signs of kind of the atrocities that were not only going to take place, but were taking place throughout the 1930s.